Chapter 7. Schaefer came up behind Hawkins and watched him tap at the radio dials. He was angry, more for his men than for himself. Schaefer was a loyalist, the kind of leader who would defend his last man if it meant his own life, no matter what. There were disadvantages to such loyalty, of course, and getting hooked into deals like this was where it sometimes got you. Schaefer knew he couldn't just walk, not with 5 men depending on him, and not in the middle of nowhere. He had to get all of them out, somehow. For he didn't trust anybody else to do it now. Not the company, not the White House. Especially not Dillon. As for the problem of Dillon, the Major knew that, though he himself had a keen sense of other men's limits and loyalties, he had one glaring flaw. He believed that combat experience made everyone as tough as he was, and he expected as much integrity as he delivered. And that kind of standard sometimes led to bitter disappointment, or worse. Dillon had treaded on a territory that bordered on the double-cross, offending Schaefer irreversibly. Rank was academic at this point. If Dillon had tried to give him an order just then, he would have responded with a contemptuous laugh. While Dillon went on rifling through the papers, the woman on the ground beside him groaned as she began to regain consciousness. A thin trickle of blood from the head wound matted her hair and ran down the side of her cheek. She began mumbling incoherently in Spanish. It sounded like a prayer. Dillon knelt down next to her and began rummaging through her pockets. He retrieved a thin nylon billfold and pulled out an identification card. Beneath a list of serial numbers was her name. Ana Gonsalves. No rank noted. Hawkins had set up the field radio on a crate just outside the palapa door. Though he had reattached the wires 3 times, he was getting very garbled reception. He listened carefully, every few minutes tapping his talk button and saying loudly, "Again! Say it again!" Finally, he looked up at Schaefer. "Major, we just stepped in some real shit here. I got a hookup with aerial serve." His voice was strained, and the sweat was pouring down his face from concentration. "Any movement?" asked Schaefer impatiently. "Everywhere. The whole fucking country seems to be busting ass to get here. Rebels must have got word out that they were being attacked." "How much time?" Schaefer pressed. "Half an hour, tops. Then this place is going to be crawling with them apes." The Major tapped Hawkins lightly on the shoulder in a gesture that managed to be equal parts reassurance and appreciation. "Good work, Hawk. Go find Mac and tell him we move in 5. Schaefer knew that he had to deal with Dillon, and as he walked across the wreckage towards the black man, he could see that the girl was sitting up. She held the side of her head in one cupped hand. Her eyes were open, but she was clearly still in a daze. Dillon was bending over her, asking a question she didn't seem to hear. The black man looked up at Schaefer as he reached them. The Major's eyes were glazed with suspicion and disdain, but Dillon seemed to have put the disagreement behind him. "She goes with us," he stated flatly. "Hey, she doesn't need us to save her." Schaefer's voice was dry. "She's going to have about 1,000 friends here in half an hour. Sorry, Dutch, she's too valuable. She's got to know their whole network." Dillon couldn't keep the excitement out of his voice. "What she knows could mean the lives of thousands of people. We take her with us," he repeated precisely. This time, it sounded like an order. Schaefer held out a massive fist, thumb pointing to the ground. His lower lip curled with suppressed fury. "We take her and she'll give away our position," he countered tightly. "Every chance she gets. No prisoners." They were sparring with something here, and it was getting bigger than logistics. There was a deep rift between them now, with the details of the mission revealed. They both knew how far down 2 opposite roads they'd travelled since the last saw each other. The sparks flying between them couldn't hide what seemed like an underlying sense of pity that they felt for each other. Dillon simply couldn't understand why Schaefer still held to an old code that a new kind of war had left far behind. For his part, Schaefer was feeling as if he had enemy troops coming at him from both sides. Or was it 2 different kinds of enemy, one inside and one outside, and Dillon was some kind of go-between? Dillon walked past Schaefer and strode to the radio hookup and grabbed the handset. He held it out to Schaefer and spoke across the ruins. "You're still under orders, Dutch," he said coldly, pulling rank at last. "You want to make the call, or should I?" Schaefer stared at him, then down at the dazed girl. He knew Dylan had won this round. There was nothing Dutch could do about it while he still had responsibility for the commando team. But he wouldn't give Dylan the satisfaction of a verbal response. He simply turned and walked away. "I'm getting my men out of this fucking pit, Dylan," he growled. "That's the mission now. The Broad's your baggage. You fall behind, you're on your own." It was a precarious and potentially dangerous standoff. Dylan was in nominal charge of the evacuation, but he knew his life depended on the Major's cooperation. At this point, Dylan's seniority counted for little more than the couple of extra stripes on his shoulder, and the shoulder was liable to get very bloody at any moment. So he simply let the challenge slide and assumed all further responsibility for the prisoner. Perhaps it seemed like a fair enough trade to the black man, since he was going to get all the glory once she had been debriefed. Meanwhile, he could handle Schaefer's anger. He had no doubt that the Major would bring them safely out of here, and after that, he and Schaefer would be off again on those opposite roads. To each his own. Still, the mission had radically changed focus for all of them. Now they had one overriding goal: get everyone out of the jungle, safe, and soon. Schaefer knelt in the kicked-up turf by the trailhead, studying a map of the border terrain that Blaine had retrieved from the Palapa. Billy, who crouched beside him, had reconnoitered about a mile upstream, and now he pointed to several features on the coded map and fleshed out details of the terrain to the north and west. The rest of the commandos were ranged behind them, covering all entrances to the camp, eyes darting, weapons cocked. "This place is too hot for a pickup," Schaefer grumbled. "That's what you're saying, isn't it?" Billy nodded. The Major had already talked to a couple of US choppers standing by just over the border. They'd radioed to Hawkins that they were less than 10 miles away, miles that under these conditions might as well have been in Siberia. "They won't touch us till we're over the border," declared Schaefer. "They made that real clear. They don't want to be tracked in Contamana airspace. Fastidious buggers, aren't they?" "Major, look," said Billy. "We can lift at LZ-49, right here." The Indian pointed to a pale green clearing on the contour map just over the border. "But it'll be awful tough going," he added grimly, moving his fingers along a stretch of heavily shaded concentric circles that indicated steep terrain. "It's all box canyons, except for this valley." And he traced lightly along a narrow passage above the head of the stream, where the shading of the map was slightly paler. Dutch whistled Ramirez over and sketched out the route. Though he trusted Billy's instincts over any map, he needed to get the navigator's view, for Ramirez would set the pace while Billy scouted ahead, and they weren't going to get anywhere if the two men weren't in sync. Billy and Ramirez had to gauge each other by an inner radar, or else they were lost. Shaking his head, Ramirez spat out the butt of his cigar. "Well, it ain't the prettiest trip I ever took, Major. In fact, it's going to be a real bitch." He eyed the jungle valley as Schaefer's finger traced it. "But if we can get above that river and then go down the gradient here, yeah, we might find a way out." He rapped the spot with his forefinger, then looked over at Billy with a crooked grin and said, "I suppose this is your idea, Tonto." Schaefer, absorbing Billy and Ramirez's agreement, gritted his teeth and inhaled deeply. "Not much choice, Pancho, right? Take the lead, double time it," he ordered, anxious now, as if they'd wasted too much time on maps. He waved an arm, signaling the men to join ranks. As the commandos hustled to the trailhead, Dylan came walking up with Anna, her head wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from a dead gorilla's shirt. Dylan had secured her hands in front. As Schaefer watched them approach, he was struck more forcefully than ever by her raw, reckless beauty, now that she was walking upright for the first time. She was tall and svelte, with a taut, sleek body like a panther, more like an Amazon warrior than the squat, thick women of her country. For ventilation in the sweltering heat, she'd unbuttoned the lower snaps on her fatigue shirt and tied the ends together, exposing her flat brown stomach and emphasizing her breasts. Her eyes were bright and alert, and her upper lip quivered with contempt and hatred towards the men who had captured her and killed her comrades. Schaefer took it all in, registered trouble, then turned back to the others as he organized their retreat. "Lock and load," he instructed gruffly. "Watch your ass." Immediately, Blaine moved out, swinging the machine gun in front of him to throw his weight forward up the hill. Then Hawkins, with the radio on his back. Everybody wanted out, sensing the impending arrival of the rebel forces, knowing from their own rage how insanely angry the guerrillas would be. Dillon gently prodded the woman forward onto the trail. The moment he touched her, she spun around, hurling a stream of insults at him in Spanish. "Yankee scum!" she snarled. "You touch me again, you pig, and I'll cut off your balls!" Dillon was in for it all right, but he was determined to take it in his stride. "It's a long walk back, honey," he replied evenly. "Make it easy on yourself." She hissed like a cat and spat at his feet, then turned to the trail with a violent twist of her head. Her long black hair, twined with a thick braid which had come loose from under her cap, slapped him across the face. Dillon silently counted 10, bent over and slipped his pack over his shoulder, and headed out, ignoring her further outbursts. As they followed the others, a voice called out in a loud whisper from behind and to the right. "Hey Dillon, over here." Dillon knew it was Mac, and didn't respond. He didn't want to hear another insubordinate jibe about the prisoner. So Mac called louder. "Dillon, I said over here." This time, the black man turned coldly to acknowledge his hulking comrade, still holding the girl by the rope that bound her wrists. Mac crouched at the edge of the underbrush with glittering eyes, a wild, astonished grin on his face. He was staring at Dillon's shoulder, as if he was going to tease the black man about his rank stripes. "Yeah, what is it, Sergeant?" Dillon asked, visibly annoyed. Without a word, Mac unsheathed his knife, gave Dillon an antic look, and turned him around by his shoulders with an air of condescension. Crawling across the strap of Dillon's pack was a 4-inch scorpion, its tail quivering. With a self-satisfied smile, Mac skewered the lethal insect on the tip of his blade and displayed its writhing death throes in front of Dillon's wincing face. Anna smirked, nodding at the disemboweled creature. "When my people catch you, you'll wish you were him," she declared with a triumphant smile that was the match of Mac's own. Dillon murmured his thanks to Mac, embarrassed and vaguely insulted, while still trying to ignore Anna's badgering. "Any time, sir," Mac responded with casual disinterest. Then, as if to wring every ounce of irony from the incident, he flung the scorpion to the ground and crunched it with his boot. He turned and strode ahead, as if to leave the woman and the non-combatants to bring up the rear. Dillon followed with a weary sigh, tugging Anna along behind him. As the small troop moved forward, Billy pulled up at the tail, furtively glancing behind him every few seconds. Since the first mile or so was clearly marked, having been used to haul equipment, Hawkins wouldn't need him to scout ahead till they came to the first rapids. Billy often covered the team's retreat, so there wasn't anything unusual about his dropping back with his ears perked. But he seemed strangely agitated, and he was breathing faster than a man in his shape ought to. He sensed a peculiar presence more strongly now than when he was in the crevasse, and it made his skin crawl. Something inexplicably familiar, yet unknown. Slowly, he scanned the tree line, straining his eyes to catch a hint of something different, something off-key. A force was out there, among the trees, waiting, watching. Billy was convinced of it. Never had his nerves been so rattled, his brain so wired. Then, oddly, the jungle began to grow silent. The incessant chirping and clattering of millions of insects and birds. Billy could almost feel the volume turning down, as if it was something in his own head that was warning the world to watch out. Billy turned and trotted away up the trail, heavy with dread. He seemed to want to put as much distance as possible now between him and the carnage of the rebel camp. Another soldier might have called it just another case of the spooks. Commando or not, a good fighter left death behind as quick as he could, or else maybe he wouldn't get up to fight tomorrow. But it wasn't the bodies bloating in the heat in the ruined camp. It wasn't the circling vultures or the rats and worms and flies gathering to feed. It was worse than all the minions of death. Far up in the tallest cottonwood, high above the wreckage of the camp, the alien had taken in every infinitesimal movement the team had made. As the men exited the site and disappeared into the trees, it uttered a low trill as it sprang from the tent of leaves into the humid air, sweeping across a lower branch in a neighbouring tree. In that horrible moment, it was clear at last that the invader had found a form. Etched against the tropical sky, it was humanoid and vast, 7 feet tall, with ice-blue scales from head to foot, and it swung from tree to tree with the brachiating ease of a golden gorilla. It wasn't man exactly, but a vision of a man, tortured and perfected by a mind that longed to advance the species and make it triumph in the jungle habitat. Replication wasn't good enough. In homage to the warriors it had tracked all day, it sought a shape deep in itself. As if to fight them to the death, it had to be itself, and them all at once. Skillfully and silently, with fluid-like grace, the creature descended branch to branch, till it reached the jungle floor. As its powerful 3-toed feet flexed in the moss, it surveyed the destruction, the remains of burning huts, the dead and dying men. With its glassy eyes bright as tungsten, it saw the last flicker of life dissipating like guttered candles. It saw glimmering, ghost-like bodies slowly darkening into charcoal. It saw what this queer, precarious world would look like when it ended. Lithe as a dancer, it glided across the clearing to the trailhead, stooping to pick up the dead scorpion. It turned the insect over and over in its 3-fingered, prehensile hand, the lifeless creature's colour fading to black as death cooled it. The alien seemed puzzled, as if it could not work out why this species, man, killed its own kind and others' kind. Then it cocked its hairless bullet head and began to make a low humming sound that gradually modulated into an uncanny and deadly accurate imitation of a human voice. Mac's voice. "Dylan, over here," sounded the eerie, chilling mimicry as it replayed the scorpion incident. Then the alien discarded the insect like a useless broken toy and strode across to the base of the tree from which it had descended. There it picked up its weapon, a short spear that it gripped like a rifle, another kind of homage. The weapon instantly changed colour and keyed to the alien's skin, a merging of reptilian tones till the arm and the weapon were flesh of one flesh. Instantly, the creature turned and made for the trail where the men had disappeared. In seconds, with perfect simian dexterity, it had sprung to the lower branches of a tree, grasping the rough bark with its clawed, hammerlock fingers, pulling itself up through the branches with astonishing speed and agility. Then it leapt free into the air again, swinging exultantly from the crown of one tree to the next. As it moved in the direction of the commando team, it was actively stalking now. Its passive observation was complete. In its wake, the jungle froze in silence, as if every creature in the wild, weak or strong, suddenly considered itself fair game. What the moth knew, what the parrot knew, what the puma knew, at that moment the terror crossed all species. All except man. No wonder the temples were overgrown. No wonder the Mayan tribes had vanished without a trace. Man didn't even have the wit to run for cover.